very warm welcome to the Spotlight series. I'm delighted to have you from across the globe, literally, joining me, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself to everyone.
Thank you, and it's nice to be here. So I'm Stuart Mennigke, and I'm speaking from Vancouver in the northern part of the Americas. This is where I live and work, and I work in leadership education and have had an association with the work of Lewis Deep Democracy for many years before it was in its current form, and have used and taught the work and grown through it myself for a long time.
I can't help but smile when I see you, Stuart, because I do remember that the first time I met you was under very different circumstances. And maybe it's quite fun to actually mention that.
I think that I met you for the first time when you were in high school, and although one doesn't often say that to people, one doesn't say that to children, but to adults you can. And I had met Myrna and had done some assessment work with her, and as was her practice, everything happened from her home. And so I was a little surprised, but not totally surprised, when some school children walked in with their friends, I think, and I was introduced to them. And then I discovered that those children actually lived in this place and were part of Myrna's home and family. I think that's how we met, and probably we were just thrust into relating because that's how people did it in your home. If someone else was in the kitchen, you said hello and made the tea, and so that was it. But yeah, that's how we met originally, I'm sure.
I remember it later, and it's interesting that you've got that memory. But I do remember making lots of cups of tea for people. But I do remember you being very involved in the marriage of Myrna to Greg.
Yes, I was, and that happened just a little while after I first began to work with Myrna, and then met Greg, and their marriage was a pretty unique kind of thing, certainly in the traditional church, as it were, because here were two people of originally different faiths, and they got married in the bishop's chapel by special permission, because anything can happen in the bishop's chapel because the bishop is the bishop. And I did that wedding, and it was a huge joy. It really was. And then, of course, I met you again there.
How's that time and at that stage in your life, you were living South Africa, to now being even further afield from me in Singapore? What's happened, and how did you use the work in leadership development? And can you explain that story?
Yes. Well, I guess it started off in a fairly formal sort of way with an instrument which Myrna and Greg had developed, which is a kind of a behavioral analysis for people in the corporate world. And I had worked with Myrna on with that tool for a little while, and had even been part of helping test its development and talking about some aspects of that work which I suggested might be introduced into that tool. And I think it was through her that I was then invited to do some work in the corporate world with a management consultancy, and so then began to use that work very extensively, so much so that in the education division that I was running, which was in the church in KwaZulu-Natal, in the Diocese of Natal, I think that all of 75 clergy were involved in this work and did it, and were mentored using that original work. And as happens with Myrna Lewis, you don't just stop there. You keep experimenting with the next thing. And so that happened a lot. I have something that I want to teach you, and I'm sure that you'll find it valuable. Myrna and I also, she ran it, I think, but I accompanied her to the first introduction of, in those days, process work at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where we managed to get the whole psych department involved in a workshop. And they thought that she was, and I guess me with her, probably a little tipsy, because it was so different from the conventional psycho work that they taught and were lecturers in at that university. However, we did it all from explanation to stating views to soft shoe shuffles to everything. And as a result of that, certainly the head of the department and at least two of the lecturers there continued in that work, and I trained them later as analysts in the behavioral life pie work that we were doing. And then I've simply made this work part of education for leaders in whatever sphere I've worked in. And so both in the church as well as in the corporate world, and for a number of years in consulting, I realized I was taking a slightly different view of how leaders should be developed. And for me, it is based on self-awareness. And so the tools which I was introduced to through this work and through Myrna and Greg really enabled that more and more until it developed for me as a kind of identity, really, for the work that I would do no matter where I was. And it might have a slightly different frame here and there, but basically that's what it was. And still today, in the work that I've done for 10 or nearly 12 years now in organization in Vancouver, I've been able to develop and use these tools. And then as Lewis Deep Democracy has developed more and more, I call it, as LDD has funneled and refined the work more and more to make it more and more usable for people, I've simply incorporated that work into the curricula of education for leaders. And so today in the organization where I work, those are the core courses which directors and others involved in it do by their choice, actually. So this is what we do. And these are the core courses that everyone that comes into the organization in these particular roles are encouraged to do, so that they understand the basics of how humans think and work and how they should be working together and what's conscious and what's not conscious and how resistance develops and what we do with it. And so, that's how it's developed for me over the years. Yeah, and it's been a pleasure, really.
There's so many things I want to pick apart, but one of the first things you said was what you're really interested in is helping leaders get self-awareness. And I suppose for me, it'd be lovely to hear from you how you see that especially currently what you're doing these days, how the Lewis Deep Democracy tools and methods and techniques that you use help leaders gain that.
I guess I'd call it some of the core work, which is at least core to much of what Lewis Deep Democracy teaches. It's those things that have become important for the leaders that I work with. And how do I know that? Well, I mean, I'm someone who doesn't like it when people become too fixed into any one particular model of teaching or doing or speaking. Yeah. But with this work, I know that it's become reasonably effective in the way people operate, because while they may not, and I mean, this is work that's developed over 10 or 12 years in the same organization where there's not much attrition among leaders at all. So how do I know that it has an effectiveness? Is because the people who lead teams, which are the ones that I work with, now, whether it's the senior most people in the organization or directors somewhat down the tier, all of them lead teams. And so I do two things. I work with the leaders one-on-one to help them deepen their understanding of self and behavioral patterns, as it were. And then I work with that leader and their team. So I guess I work with something like 25, sometimes up to 31 or 2 teams. And over a number of years, for me, it's been working alongside the leader and only working with the leader when they're only working with the team when their leader is present, as it were, as a form of teaching, I guess. And what's happened as a result of that is while people may not always understand all the details of what we teach, so they may have been on a course which we call Deep Democracy 101. And what that does is it takes the Lewis Deep Democracy concept, say, of an unconscious and resistance lines, and simply teaches them and helps people then apply that into their day-to-day work. So why I know that it grows in effectiveness is because I hear when people talk to one another, they may not always understand the finer details of what we taught in an LDD curriculum course. But when I listen to them talk with one another, and I listen to them talk about their interaction with their clients, then I hear them say, well, that's only one opinion. Did you actually ask for the no? Well, what do you mean? Did you ask for the other voice, the other opinion? Well, if you didn't, then that's what you need to do. And so it's like watching people take a Lewis Deep Democracy principle and apply it in its most empirical form, really, so that can you make decisions with people who understand nothing about deep democratic principles or process work or whatever, but they understand something about making decisions in their way? And if they can get to the place of saying, but there must be another view, then I know that, they've taken something on, as it were. And then there are other courses which I teach in, which is curriculum I've developed, but I kind of mingle them together with various aspects of Lewis Deep Democracy, so that always there's the basis of understanding what is conscious, what is not conscious, where the wisdom and awareness of groups lie, and what happens when people make decisions. So I draw that work into a lot of other things that I do. In fact, I draw it into most things because I never teach a course now which hasn't had a foundation somewhere else, so that I would start with a particular course and then build these things as we go up. And hopefully that has a kind of a residual sense that LDD is trying to instill in people. And when you look at what I, for example, do now with some people, or with actually many people, like a shift, what is called ShiftEQ or ShiftED, but ShiftEQ in particular, those principles are there and people understand them, and they may not understand all the details, but it's a build that has happened from a place to a place. And so it's foundational. And so as I come to think about retiring from the organization, I don't have any fear that what we've instilled in people is real and it will last, and they will say, well, we didn't understand that, and that was very complicated. And I remember when Myrna taught it, I didn't understand what was going on. And somebody said to me the other day, and when you were teaching it a little while ago, Stuart, we didn't understand what you were on about, but actually we think we understand now.
I mean, it sounds like obviously Lewis Deep Democracy has been with you for a long time now in various different ways, but you start using ShiftEQ as part of your toolkit in what you deliver when teaching leaders or groups. Can you share a moment when teaching it where a group kind of like actually said, I get it now, or this is another way of talking about different views by doing the debate, or like, is there something that you can remember that you can share with us?
Well, probably a few. I was reflecting yesterday with a leader, a senior director of a team, on the value of bringing their team of 6 people who were taking on a new, and they were doing fairly important transitional work in the organization. They brought 2 new members onto their team. So now we had 6, a team of 4 that I'd worked with before, and then another 2. And I suggested what I wanted to do with them, which was a ShiftEQ course. And I said the reason I wanted to do it was because of the role that they were now taking on in the organization in project management, and that they were actually going to be involved in transitional stuff in the organization that was kind of really important, and how leaders were guided in various projects, needed to be underpinned by a whole lot of material. And this group, I was reminded yesterday, this group had in different ways learned some of these principles, which we would now say form a basis of some courses in Lewis Deep Democracy. Some of them had learned it, parts of those principles, a long time ago, some of them even 10 years ago. But as we went through this course, to be honest, they were all quite sharp and motivated people, and were very dedicated to this course. We met every other day for 2 weeks and a day in between, so that they could practice with a buddy the principles that they had learned the previous day. But I noticed that as the course went on, from the first into the second week, not only were they always there on time, which I guess is that team's habit anyway, but they were there with enthusiasm. And when I asked them to share, because there was homework which they needed to do, which they all did, and when I asked them to share, they came up with kind of unique examples of how they had checked in, or how they had done a debate or whatever. And one of the things that surprised me in this particular group was, I can remember one of the members in previous years, very, mind sharp person, was very, if not skeptical, but always reserved about the work, as it were. And I noticed an enthusiasm in him that I had not seen before. So much so that he not only shared his examples of what was happening in between this session and that session, but he was in touch with his colleagues to check with them that they had also done it and what their examples were. And from being quite a reserved person in terms of learning, kind of jumped into, well, if no one else wants to lead the check-in, well, I will. If no one else is going to do the debate, I suppose I can, And so I realized that, I have a huge respect for this person's intellect and for their design ability and so on. But to see a kind of I would almost say a childlike enthusiasm for learning be revived, and then to hear him at the end, when we checked out for the whole course, to say why this had been important for him, and how he'd suddenly been able to apply things and see the connections of things that he hadn't seen before. That was very special, actually.
So it sounds like it was really pragmatic, really helping for him to be able to use it in his day-to-day.
Very much so. And to say, well, never saw this before, but I see it now. And it was encouraging, just very encouraging. And, when you teach a lot, you often have students in your group that you rely on, as it were, or you're encouraged by, or something. So here were 6 very mature people, both in their positions and in leading teams, but also, some of them, probably whatever middle-aged is, but, they were mature people. And to see them take on a kind of a childlike enthusiasm for something was amazing. Yeah. And I think it was one of the things that I began to sell with, say, ShiftEQ in Lewis Deep Democracy is that you've managed to filter the material to a place that this is the basic that needs to be taught. And for me, doing that without having to embroider it at all. And then embroidering when it comes to examples and people having a go at leading something. And that's been a very successful part of ShiftEQ, for example.
And from a personal perspective, I mean, Stuart, you talked about this particular leader and his enthusiasm for it, but in a sense, it's been years that you have stuck by Lewis Deep Democracy, or like kept it in your life. It obviously is still feeding or providing you with something as a person. Can you describe what that is? Why has it remained? Why hasn't it been replaced or changed?
I wonder, because I am a person who looks for new things in terms of teaching and learning. If it's not too complicated, I think that I would say that one of the reasons is that it's provided for me not just an empirical formula for how people and groups need to or can interact in not just in I was going to say a business sense, but in any team, really. But there's something else in it, which is, I think that there's a researchability, if I could call it that, which I don't think is yet fully explored in Lewis Deep Democracy. When I hear and read the interactions on the thread that we have for LDD instructors, you can pick up some pretty interesting threads of people who have been teachers all their lives and have taught in colleges and universities and who are therapists and so on. But I think that there's a researchability, if I could call it that, in this material, which hasn't yet been fully realized. And what I mean by that is that I think when something worthwhile is given birth to, as it were, then it grows, there's a certain protection, if you like, that one wants to have over that. So if you design something, well, you want to protect that design because you know that empirically it's like really important for people to understand that thing. I think that without always having been able to explain it, what's there for me is that when I say researchability, I mean there's a development of this work, which in its simplicity is a good, strong, basic curriculum from a learning perspective, because I work in education. So I think that I've seen part of that desire for almost protecting and surrounding the work of Lewis Deep Democracy and saying it needs to be like this and it needs to be like that, and we should teach it like this and we should teach it like that, to a place now where I'm beginning to see, and as a researcher I find that exciting, where people are bringing not necessarily other methodologies, but maybe bringing their practice of Lewis Deep Democracy's work into so many fields in which they work. And in that, as they begin to share it, I think that what is researchable and therefore what will be lasting, emerging more than I've seen it emerge. For me, why have I stuck with it? Because I believe that you can't be a successful leader unless you do have deepening self-awareness. And I think that the work of LDD encourages that deepening awareness of self. And because it gives the basic granules for understanding self and understanding self in a group of people. So that's what I mean by I began to notice that the researchability of this work is, I would say, without being condescending, beginning to grow. In other words, take its place in the world of researchable work. Well, one, because it is researchable when you go back and look at where it comes from, right? But two, if I could say this, that I think in the last couple of years, LDD has purposefully lost some of the desire for protection to give it over to what must happen inevitably when useful and good things emerge in the world, which is there will be people who mess them up. There will be people who misuse them. There will be people who misquote them. And yet through that, there is an awareness of a thread which actually doesn't get broken. And I think that's what I find attractive about the work of LDT. Yeah. And I mean, I'm on a journey with it as well. So, yeah. But I find that encouraging.
So you said you're on a journey with it. What do you mean when you say you personally on a journey with it?
Well, because I think there was a time when, and you might know that as someone who's supervised me as well, I think there was a time where my need to embroider the work, when I say embroider, I mean just add the frills here and there, was quite important. And now I find that teaching the basics just as they are is much more successful than embroidering anything. Why? Because it gives people the opportunity to understand the basics and say, oh, and then be able to interpret them in their own way, or it's not interpret, apply them, in a way. But do they understand that as a basic and that as a basic and that as a basic? I think that's what I'm learning as I go through it more and more, as long as also that I can describe some aspects, for example, of role theory, but I can describe them from a theological perspective if I need to, and I can describe them from an intellectual perspective if I am writing something, and I can describe them as just a normal thing that parents could do with their children if we're talking in a family sense. That's what I'm finding more and more attractive. Yeah.
To hear you describe role theory in that different way, like how you do apply it to your situations in a church or within a family. How does it apply?
In the couple of weeks before Christmas in the Christian calendar last year, I was working in a downtown cathedral in Vancouver as part of a clergy team, where one of the tasks they have from time to time is to preach. And in our tradition, you generally preach on a series of readings from scripture which are given to you. You don't choose them yourself. They're the ones that are set for the day, as it were. We call the 4 weeks before Christmas Advent, which most of the world seems to use those terms now, preparing for something special. And I was presented, I knew that I was down to preach that week, and so I'd begun to prepare a couple of weeks before that. And in fact, Myrna Lewis was staying with us that year. This was last Christmas. And the reading that I was preparing was what we called in the Christian tradition the visitation, which was this young Jewish maiden called Mary, just 15 or so, who was pregnant through God's Spirit and made her way to her cousin, who was much older. And there were two women, and the cousin, who stayed a donkey ride away, a couple of days of donkey ride away, was in her 6th month of pregnancy. Mary was right at the beginning of her pregnancy. And so they couldn't have no communication before, because there was no email or whatever in those old biblical days. But as these two women met and greeted one another, biblical tradition talks about the child in the older cousin's womb leapt at the joy of meeting her cousin, who was to be the mother of Jesus. And the most exciting thing for me was trying to explain, using role theory, how the energy which was in one person could, using quantum understanding, reverberate with the energy that was in another person, and how they could have a particular kind of understanding, which only they could have had in that sense, through the energy which united them, as it were. And so I'd built a sermon around role theory and applied it to that particular story, which is a very ancient story in the Christian tradition. Of course, it was quite a test. I mean, there was much more that was said, but it was quite a test because the professor herself was sitting there. I mean, Myrna Lewis. She'd come to church with us that day, and so she asked me if I would let her have a copy of that explanation of role theory. So that was one.
And then, Stuart, I know that you mentioned to me about the risks people do when they do innovative stuff. Maybe you can talk to me a little bit more about that.
I think the risk that I was referring to when I mentioned that originally was that when something innovative and worthwhile is created, particularly in the scholarly world, then it often begins as something that we need to protect quite carefully. But eventually we have to let it go. And as we let it go, we kind of give it to the world in a way, and not always being sure what will happen to it. And that's a risk. I think that's a huge risk. But I've often thought that Lewis Deep Democracy has been involved in that kind of risk in the last while that I've been involved with it, because any worthwhile invention, whether it's like this case in the psychological world and in the quantum world, any worthwhile invention is going to want to be protected initially, but it's a huge risk putting it out there because of what I said a bit earlier about people, using or misusing or misunderstanding or whatever. And yet, when you take that risk with something that is empirically sound, then it will find its way through that. And I think the difficulty is the inventors needing to take that risk. I mean, for me, Arnold Mindell was somebody who took that risk with process-orientated psychology. I saw that when we tried to explain that to a group of traditional psychology teachers at a university, they thought we were nuts. But I mean, Myrna, she took the risk, said, we're going to do this. Doesn't matter how crazy it sounds to them, he took the risk. And I think when you take that risk to do that and let it out there and say, well, the risk is that this might be damaged, it might be messed with. But if it's solid and it's sound and it's worthwhile and it has good research bases to it, then it will last. It will move into the next place and people will take it and do research on it. And so in a sense, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the world of invention and the world where you have to take a risk with anything that is, in a scholarly sense, worthwhile. And there will always be people who mess it up. I mean, any belief system gets tampered with. And then people sometimes take it and make their own little track about the whole thing and then attract a whole lot of people to go along with them. But I think the risk means that when people are taught in a sound way about something, they will protect that thing. They will take it and hold it and protect it and research it. And some parts will be added to and some will be withdrawn and it will be realizations, but the risk will be worth it.
So I'm going to ask you a hard question. If you could give me a couple of reasons why you think that risk has been worth it for Lewis Deep Democracy, for Myrna and Greg Lewis to have persevered, to have gone out there, for Myrna to have continued it, for me to continue with it. Why is it that it's worth it? For maybe you personally, for groups, for the world? I don't know if it's possible for me to try and get you to spit a few things out.
That's a hard question. Why is it worth it? Well, one reason might be that as we understand humanity more, we come to understand the value of collaboration and group, not above the individual, alongside the individual, and how important group opinion is for humans, I think, because we live in a very individualistic world now. And so the one for me might just be that promoting a psychology, if you like, which says groups of people can hold and discover a wisdom because it's bigger than them and it's bigger than the individual, which is what deep democracy is teaching. I think that is one of the things that eventually comes true. I'm busy writing a book, and I had to have some interviews and quote Myrna Lewis a little while ago about the value of the corporate, the group, being more or less important than the efficacy of working just with the individual. And I was looking not for a dualistic thing, because people will easily take something and polarize it, but I was looking for, what is the middle road through this? And I think it was that good therapists, for example, know the value of how to work with group, but they also know the value of how to support individuals within that group as they discover new things.
I think you answered it really nicely, though, Stuart. The way in which I interpret your answer is like, hey, in this world, we have to work together more and more so. We have to kind of deal with working with different people in different situations. And if we are able to actually work together and listen to groups of people and understand more what's going on, then maybe there's a hope, is because we'll be able to discover and uncover the wisdom that that group has. So for me, that was...
Oh, absolutely. And because in the world as we watch it today, and I work in leadership education, we have so many examples of leaders who are just not interested in hearing what anyone else has to say. So the typical autocratic leader, and it's part of what the world is struggling with at the moment in a huge, huge way. And no longer does it just belong on this continent or that continent. It is spread as autocratic leaders seek to have influence in places which are not even theirs. And that is typical of autocratic leaders. But the other side of that is discovering the beauty of what it means when you say to a group, what do we think? And for a leader to learn that it's okay for them to be wrong because the group has more wisdom than the individual. And I think it's just a very current and terrible problem that we suffer in the world at the moment. And I think it comes from, well, we can trace it back a whole long way. But one of the things I think that Lewis Deep Democracy offers the world today, just through teaching here, there, and everywhere, teaching the same principles, is that there can be a return, if you like, to a kind of society where we look for what the group has to offer and not the autocratic individual. So I think that's a struggle, and that struggle, well, we're living in it so hugely now, but it will go on and on. And it's been there through history. Autocratic leaders have been there through history. But right as we speak today, there's examples, fresh examples every day in the world of autocratic leadership and the group reacting against that and saying enough. And if they had a language, like the wisdom of the group and awareness of the group, well, wouldn't that be amazing?
Thank you for joining, and thank you for being with us today. And I hope you go well.
Thank you, and to you too. Bye.